everyone, it's Jenny here and welcome to the first episode of a new series on my channel. This series is going to be about unsolved murder mysteries in British history. Now, I'm very passionate about English history, and I'm also very passionate about unsolved murder mysteries, so I thought I'd combine the two and share some unsolved murder mysteries throughout British history. Now, these stories are centuries old, but I do want to treat them with the utmost respect because these stories are about people and events that lived and happened in real life. And just a warning for this first episode, it does talk about children being murdered / disappearing, so if this is the kind of material you do not want to see, then please skip this video or go on to something a bit more happy and positive. Today's story is about the princes in the tower. The princes in the tower were two young boys, Edward and Richard, and they were both heirs to the throne of England. Their father, Edward IV, was constantly in battle throughout his reign as King of England, in what would be known as the Cousins' War or the Wars of the Roses, which was a civil war in England between the houses of York and Lancaster, who were both fighting for their right for the English crown. Now, with Edward having two sons, he secured the line of York to continue as kings of England. Now, sadly, Edward and Richard faced an unfortunate fate and were locked in the tower for whatever reason we do not know, and what happened to them in the end of their lives is still not solved and still remains a mystery to this day. But their story has baffled historians and many history lovers like me to really wonder what actually happened to these boys. Were they murdered, or did they actually survive their captivity and escape? When Edward IV unfortunately passed away, Richard III had his plan in motion to collect his oldest nephew Edward from outside of London. He travelled, collected Edward and brought him back to London and lodged him into the Tower of London as this preparation for his coronation, which would officiate Edward's role as King of England. Now, because of locking him away in the Tower, Edward's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, also Queen of England at the time to Edward IV, was very suspicious of Richard's actions and did not trust him. Therefore, she ran to Westminster Abbey to hide herself away with her daughters and her son Richard. Unfortunately, Edward was kept locked away in the Tower and unfortunately would never escape. In the month of May of 1483, the 12-year-old Edward was to be crowned King of England, but sadly May turned to June, and it was inevitable that the young boy was never to be crowned as King of England, and shortly his brother Richard would also be joining him in the Tower. During this all went on, their uncle Richard III seemed to be planning behind closed doors to seal his own fate as King of England. He gathered together a court of lords and created a lawful document called Titulus Regulus, which stated that his brother Edward IV, before he married Elizabeth Woodville, he was already pre-contracted to marry Lady Eleanor Butler, which meant that his marriage with Elizabeth Woodville was unlawful. It was not a true marriage in the eyes of God. And sadly, their children born from their relationship were declared as bastards, and bastards were not legitimate for the throne of England, which meant sadly that the 12-year-old Edward and 10-year-old Richard were not legitimate for the crown of England, which meant that the young Edward couldn't be crowned as King of England under law. Now, sadly, Edward IV had passed away, and their other brother, George, was also executed under breaking the law, so Richard was the only remaining son of the House of York, which meant by law he was in line to be the next King of England. Now, Edward IV was a very beloved king, and because his brother had managed to lock the two beloved sons away and declare himself King of England, there was a big divide. Some people believed that Richard was the true King of England, other people believed that the young boys were to be King of England. Now, sadly, there were reports that the two young boys were seen in the Tower, but after the summer of 1483, there was never any more reports of them being seen, and slowly but surely as time passed, people just assumed they died or disappeared, and centuries on, the mystery of their disappearance is still a mystery. The first theory of the fate of the boys, and the one that is the most popular among historians, is that their uncle Richard III planned their murder. Now, it's been assumed that Richard hired a knight to commit the crime. Now, there's so many valid reasons why Richard would want this to happen. Yes, he declared the boys as bastards by law, but his older brother Edward IV, when he was king, was a very popular and beloved king by the English public. and to see his 2 sons locked away so unfairly was bound to anger a few people, actually a lot of people. And there was actually an attempt to rescue the boys from the tower while Richard was king. And in the eyes of Richard, there could be so many attempts, and one day the boys could actually escape the tower, and he really couldn't risk the thought of 2 boys spending the rest of their childhood training to fight and bring back their crown. Richard couldn't handle it, and it's pretty easy to think that Richard could easily have hired somebody to kill the boys. It's been speculation that a knight was hired to kill the 2 boys. Now, a knight is known to fight, he's known to violence, he's been around a violent background, so killing 2 young boys for the safety of his country was probably something that he could have easily done. It was reported later on in time, after Richard II lost his crown and was usurped by Henry VII, that the same knight had broken the law for a different reason, and under torture, it was supposedly reported that he confessed to killing the boys under Richard III's orders. Now, it's a pretty strong allegation, and again, when it comes to history, a lot of people write what they think. It's never any actual solid fact, so it's a very strong possibility that Richard III could have murdered these 2 boys, but at the same time, there is no official or physical evidence to say that he did it. But on the other hand, he could have done it. The second theory is that King Henry VII planned for the murder of the boys. When Richard III imprisoned the 2 boys in the tower, Henry was in exile in France. He was the last chance for the House of Lancaster to take back the crown of England that the House of Lancaster had had decades before. After spending years in France training for this moment, Henry travelled over to England, and when he arrived on the shores, he met Richard III in battle, a battle known as the Battle of Bosworth, and would be the last battle in the Wars of the Roses. Henry was the victor, and Richard III was killed in battle. Henry VII was to be the King of England. The first plan of action for Henry VII as king was to marry Elizabeth of York, the oldest daughter of the House of York. Now, the only obstacle that prevented the marriage from taking place was Richard III's Titulus Regulus, the legal document that made all of the children of the House of York illegitimate and bastards, so therefore Henry couldn't really marry her as queen. However, Henry reversed that. Therefore, Elizabeth of York and her younger siblings all became legitimate. Now, the only problem with that was that reinstated the 2 young boys to become future heirs to the King of England. Now, with Henry VII being a usurper, he wasn't a very popular king when he first started his reign. Throughout Henry's reign, there was still a threat from the 2 young boys. On 2 separate occasions, 2 young men both rose up against Henry VII, and they declared that they were Richard, the young boy who had escaped from the tower and was coming back for revenge. Now, this made Henry very, very suspicious and paranoid throughout his reign, and unfortunately, he became a very, very unsuccessful king. Because of these rebellions, he raised taxes and spent a lot of money bringing together armies to bring these 2 young men down. Unfortunately, the first man wasn't actually Richard, and he was found to be a fraud. On the second occasion, it's still debated whether this young man was actually Richard or whether he was another fraud. He'd spent years in Ireland bringing together an army and came over to London to try and fight against Henry VII. Unfortunately, his rebellion failed, and Henry captured him. However, this young Irishman was also forgiven, but later on executed. Now, he was adamant throughout his life that he was the young Richard, but again, there's no solid proof that he was actually Richard. Another strong theory to suggest that Henry VII was the murderer of the 2 young boys was that later on in his reign, he dismissed his mother-in-law Elizabeth Woodville from court and sent her to a nunnery, and took all of her lands. Now, it's been speculated that the reason that he did this was Elizabeth was very, very suspicious of Henry and believed that he had murdered the boys, and frankly, she was probably a threat and would bring this out to the public. Therefore, Henry decided to do this as a punishment to her and to keep her quiet. Sadly, Elizabeth Woodville died 6 years later after being sent to a nunnery, but again, there's no proof to say that Henry actually murdered the boys, and this is a very, very strong claim, but again, it's very, very far-fetched. If Elizabeth Woodville knew about the boys, no matter what, she would have declared it and made it to the public. However, I just think that because she was such a heavy influence on her daughter Elizabeth of York, Henry probably felt like she was too much of an influence and would turn his wife against him. And I think personally that's why he sent Elizabeth Woodville away. I mean, who would want a naggy mother-in-law? Whether Henry VII was the murderer of the two young boys, it still remains a mystery to historians centuries later. All of the evidence pointing to Henry VII being the killer of the two young boys, just like Richard III, they're very circumstantial and were written in the time where people liked or disliked Henry VII, so they would be very biased in their sources. Contemporaries reported in 1486 that Henry ordered for the murder of the two boys, believing that they were still in the Tower. Now, personally, I have to disbelieve this story. If Henry VII had murdered the two boys in 1486, he would probably have made a public announcement to the English public that the two young boys were dead. However, it could also be argued that if he had declared that he had murdered the two young boys, he would be hated even more by the English public, and there would be more rebellions against his crown. Whether he'd murdered the two boys or not, I found it very, very difficult that 3 years after they were locked in the Tower, he finally killed them. I just feel like it would have been too late in time for Henry to finally make an action against the boys. I think if the two boys were really a big massive threat to Henry, he would have got rid of them as soon as he'd become king. However, by the time he'd become king, all the public attention towards the two young boys had faded. So really, Henry could have just let it all settle and just left the public to assume that Richard III was the killer. The third theory was that the two young boys weren't actually murdered at all, and that Richard had actually escaped the Tower. There were many rescue attempts on the boys to take them from the Tower, but they were reported to have all failed, but it still didn't stop rumours spreading around that Richard had escaped. Now, when Henry VII was king, there were 2 attempts where 2 young gentlemen came from out of nowhere and declared that they were Richard. The first gentleman failed in his campaign and was found to be a fraud. However, the second gentleman, Perkin Warbeck, had spent many, many years in France, growing up and preparing for this final moment. He'd gathered an army and tried to fight against Henry VII, but he was found to be a fraud. But he still thought that he was Richard, and many people actually believed he was Richard. But again, just like any other piece of evidence in this story, it's very, very circumstantial. Richard could have survived, but it just doesn't seem very likely that Richard had actually survived the Tower, and I do believe, in my own personal opinion, that the 2 boys were murdered, and I think there is some physical evidence to actually suggest that. In the 1600s, excavation work was taking place in the Tower of London, and that was where the workmen made a very grisly and horrible discovery. 2 young skeletons were found underneath the staircase, both identified as male. There were also scraps of velvet discovered on the skeletons, which suggested that these 2 young boys came from a very high or royal background, because velvet at that time was a very, very expensive material and not an awful lot of people could afford it. The 2 skeletons were buried in London, and to this day they are to be lawfully left alone. Historians and archaeologists have begged for permission from the law to get the skeletons from out of their graves and to study them further, and using modern DNA analysis to determine whether that these 2 skeletons are actually Edward and Richard. Sadly, no permission has been given, and whether they actually be given permission in the future, I really, really doubt it. I feel like the 2 skeletons should be put to rest, but it still doesn't stop me from being very, very curious about whether these 2 skeletons are actually the 2 young boys. In my own personal opinion, I do believe that the 2 skeletons are actually the 2 boys. It just seems too much of a coincidence for 2 young boys to be discovered underneath the staircase with scraps of velvet to show that they were from a high background. It's just too much of a coincidence. Many people have been murdered in the Tower, so to have the discovery of 2 young boys discovered under the stairs, who were also around the same age as Richard and Edward when they were murdered, just seems too much of a coincidence, and I do personally believe that the 2 young boys were murdered and smothered in their sleep. The reason I believe that is that when the skeletons were also discovered, there was markings on the skulls of the 2 young boys to suggest that their noses had been broken, which could heavily suggest that they were smothered in their sleep. If it was used by a pillow, I feel like the pillow would have been too soft of a pressure on the boys, and it would have still killed them, but I feel like whoever had killed them actually forced their own hand on the young boys' faces, and while smothering them, probably put too much pressure and actually broke the young boys' noses, which is horrible to think about, but the physical evidence suggests that. I do believe that the two young princes were murdered, and it's a very, very sad story because I have brothers around the same age as Edward and Richard when they were killed, and I can't imagine it happening, but sadly this story is a real one. Two young boys were murdered because they were a threat to a crown. Could you imagine it happening in this day and age? It just seems centuries ago things like this happened all the time. Politics was disgusting. Royalty would fight against family members to take control of their own crowns. It's a very horrible history, but it's very, very important that we talk about it because it does keep people interested and curious. My final conclusion about the princes in the tower was that they were actually murdered in the tower. The discovery of the two skeletons is too circumstantial to deny that it's them. There's too much evidence around this to deny that it's the princes. I believe the two princes were unfortunately smothered in their sleep and then buried underneath the staircase. Richard III and Henry VII both remain as the main suspects in this case, and with Richard III and Henry VII, there's so much evidence to support the theories that both of these men killed the princes. When it comes to Henry VII, I believe all of the evidence pitted against him was propaganda to make him out to be a villain. Henry had taken the crown from the line of York. The House of York had been very, very popular in the eyes of England, so to have somebody from the House of Lancaster take it from them, it made Henry very, very unpopular, and I wouldn't be surprised for them to be rumours about Henry murdering the boys, but I feel like Richard had murdered them and paved the way for Henry to have a very successful reign and to marry Elizabeth of York and have the Houses of Lancaster and the Houses of York reunited. However, when it comes to Richard III, I find it very, very difficult that he would have the audacity to murder his two nephews. When his brother Edward IV was king, they weren't just brothers, they were best friends. As soon as Edward IV became king, he had given Richard everything he ever wanted. He gave him titles, riches, lands, and they had such an amazing relationship as two brothers. So it was very, very shocking when Richard III turned around the decision and made himself king and made his two nephew bastards. It's very, very sad that he did that, but to then take it a step further and murder his two nephews just seems very, very dehumanising and disgusting. But Richard III has a lot more motive to kill the two young boys compared to Henry VII. But there's still a lot of circumstantial evidence rather than there being actual physical proof. So I'm very torn about whether it was Richard or Henry that murdered the two boys. I'm more inclined to believe that Richard III murdered the two young boys, but knowing how great of a relationship he had with the two young boys' father, Edward IV, it just makes it more heartbreaking that Richard III could murder these two young boys. And it gave Richard III the title of being the most infamous king of England, which isn't surprising. I mean, who would want to kill two young boys? It's very disturbing. Thank you guys so much for watching the first episode of this new series. I know this kind of thing is a lot different to what I usually put on my channel, but it's something that I've been very, very interested in doing for quite a while now. What do you guys think about the story of the princes in the tower? Who do you believe killed the two young boys? I have my own final conclusions, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are about it down in the comments below. Who do you think killed them, and is there any other theories that you believe in that weren't mentioned in this video? Again, I'm very, very interested in history and murder mysteries, and I find it very, very interesting to pull up stories from centuries ago and explore them in 2018. Thank you guys for watching, and I am very excited to see you in the second episode. Bye!